thanks for joining us today at Caldwell Community College and Technical Institute. Today's show this week is all about risotto. I love risotto. It's a nice dish. It's also a nice technique to learn. It's more than just a dish. It's actually a technique that will help ensure you have a true perfect risotto every time you make it. So let me show you some of the ingredients that we're going to be using today. We're going to start out with our arborio rice. Now, arborio is a short grain rice, so it has a lot of starch in it. And the technique behind risotto allows us to use that starch to make this dish a nice, creamy consistency, which is what we're used to seeing when you have a risotto. And that's all due to the starch that's in the rice. So we're going to use arborio. Used to be grown in Italy, now it's grown in the US as well, so you can find it more than just in Italy. But it is a short grain rice that we use to make the dish. So the rice itself is not called risotto, that's the name of the dish, but the rice we use is arborio. You can find it at any local supermarket has arborio rice nowadays. The risotto we're going to prepare today will be a simple mushroom risotto. During this process, I'll show you a few different substitutions that we can make. That'll allow you to make all kinds of different types of risottos, just switching out some of the aromatics and a few of the ingredients that we're going to be using today. So today we're going to use cremini mushrooms, which is a baby portobello. I think they have a lot more flavor than just your white button mushrooms, but you can substitute any mushroom that you prefer, whether it be beach mushrooms or oysters or maitake or portobellos if you want to. What we did do is go ahead and roast these ahead of time. So this is just oil, salt, and pepper, tossed in a mixing bowl and put in a high temperature oven around 425 degrees for about 10 to 12 minutes. And what that does is it starts caramelizing a lot of the sugars and develops a lot of that flavor for us, and it helps cut back on that cooking time just a little bit during that cooking process. And we'll add a little bit of garlic and white wine. We'll finish with some Parmesan and some fresh thyme to give it some extra earthy flavor. So let's go ahead and get started with the dish. First things first, we're going to condition our pan. Okay, this is a good rule of thumb for all the home cooks out there. A nice trick that a lot of people really don't think about, and they don't really don't come to them, is conditioning the pan. Making sure we get the pan hot first before we add anything to it, okay? If we get the pan hot first, our oil's going to heat twice as fast, our product's going to heat twice as fast, right? So it's all about time management, right? So our pan's getting nice and hot on high heat. And for this dish, we're going to start out with our onions, okay? I don't want a lot of color, a lot of caramelization on my onions, so we're going to start it out at a medium heat. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil in the pan. I use an oil blend, which is an extra virgin and a canola oil. You can use a 25 to 75% or a 50-50, whatever you prefer. I like the oil blend because I get the flavor from the extra virgin olive oil, and I get a higher smoke point from the canola oil. All right. So I can feel my pan starting to warm up. Let's add our aromatics. About a half a cup of onion diced. Notice my pan's nice and hot. My oil's already hot. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that back down to about a good medium heat. Again, I don't want a lot of color on my onions, okay? I want to be very careful with the color on my onions. If you get an onion peel, don't be afraid to take it out. All right, so we're going to sweat these down until they become translucent. Translucent. Sweating means we don't want any caramelization. Okay, so we don't want a lot of color. Translucent meaning as it starts to turn color and become transparent. So now I'm going to add my rice. You might think I'm crazy adding dry rice to a dry pan, but what we're going to do is start to release some of this starch. We're going to start toasting that rice until it's nice and aromatic. This is going to help release some of the starch. You might have to adjust your fat. I'm going to add just a little bit more fat to the pan. You want to make sure all the rice gets coated with the fat. You want to briefly toast that rice. All right. Now I'm going to add my mushrooms. Remember, these are already, might be a little too much. I'm going to take some of those out. Remember, these are already roasted, so that's why I didn't add them with my onions. Okay? Just going to bring the heat back to them. Toss these in with my rice. And I can already smell that flavor happening. Okay? Like I said, you could use a lot of different mushroom types for this. If I were to use a oyster mushroom or a shiitake mushroom, I probably wouldn't roast them beforehand. You can just saute them in the pan. So I added a touch of garlic. I like adding garlic at the end because garlic tends to burn real quick. So I always like adding garlic at the end. So once you start smelling that garlic, you know you're ready to go. That garlic's good. Nice toss. Now we're going to deglaze, okay? Deglazing lifts all that fond, all that goodness off the bottom of the pan. And I want to make sure I do this off the heat because I don't want you leaving your kitchen without your eyebrows. Okay, so off the heat. We're using a little bit of white wine to deglaze with. Notice that nice sizzle. It's exactly what you want to hear. You want that pan to be nice and hot. You want to hear a nice sizzle. It's going to lift all that flavor off the bottom of the pan. Starting to incorporate. Now, we can start adding our liquids. I didn't tell you about the liquids yet. Traditional rice, long grain like jasmine or basmati rice would be a 1-to-2 ratio. For risotto, we're going to use a 1-to-3 or a 1-to-4 ratio. And what does that mean? That means 1 part dry rice to 3 parts liquid or 4 parts liquid. Why does one recipe have 3 parts and one have 4? Well, I'll tell you why. It depends on your heat control, and it depends on the ingredients you're adding to the dish. So for the first example, heat control. What do I mean by heat control? Cooking is all about controlling your time and your temperature, right? So if I got my temperature too high, my moisture is going to evaporate out of the pan, the rice isn't going to absorb, which means I'm probably going to have to add more liquid to it. Hence, the 4-to-1 ratio or the 1-to-4 ratio. Second example, you might have other ingredients going into the dish. This dish we're actually going to finish with a little bit of cheese. When you finish a dish with cheese like this, it'll tighten it up. So we're going to add a little bit more liquid to help loosen this dish up so it's not so thick. Okay? So we're using a 4-to-1 ratio. Now the trick to risotto is to add your liquids about 1/3 at a time. So I got a nice ladle over here. I started out with about 1 cup of rice. If I was to add 1/3 of my liquid, I'm going to add about 1 cup to 1.5 cups of liquid to start out. All right. Remember I told you it's all about time and temperature. So we're going to control this temperature. We're going to turn it on a low simmer. Again, the objective is to let this rice absorb the flavor, absorb the liquid, and release that starch at the same time. So we don't want to have our heat too high. Or as I said before, our liquid would evaporate too quickly. You don't want to have it too low either. So what liquid am I using for this dish today? Today we made a mushroom stock. Now I'll tell you a quick trick to make a good, easy mushroom stock at home. Just buying some simple veg stock at the store. Or if you make chicken stock or vegetable stock at home, it's very easy to make mushroom stock with what you're buying for this dish already. So if you were to buy cremini mushrooms or baby portobellos, what I like to do is take the stems out, take a pot of chicken stock or vegetable stock, bring it up to a simmer, add those mushroom stems and just let it steep on the back burner for 15 to 30 minutes, however long you desire, or until that flavor is achieved. And that's a good, simple way to make a mushroom stock. So that's essentially what I did with this. Took all my cremini mushrooms, took all the stems out, the caps I quartered, tossed with salt, pepper, extra virgin olive oil, roasted those in the oven at a high temperature. And all the stems I put with this stock, this vegetable stock, and let that infuse for about 30 minutes so I'd have a nice mushroom stock. All right. So the rice is really starting to absorb here. Getting close to adding our liquid. Now the classic Parmesan risotto. You would just eliminate the mushroom, do a simple water or vegetable stock instead of the mushroom stock. And classical Parmesan risotto is just white wine, Parmesan, and maybe a touch of garlic. That's optional. That's your classical Parmesan risotto. Same technique though, same technique, right? Sweat our onions down, toast our rice, right? Deglaze is optional with a little white wine if you want some white wine. Then you're always going to add your liquids a third at a time, okay? Whether it's a 1-to-3 ratio or 1-to-4 ratio, still add your liquids a third at a time. As you can see, my pan's starting to get a little dry. Rice is absorbing my liquid. So now I'm going to add my next step of liquids. During this second step of liquids, you should start seeing some of the starch starting to come out of the rice. And that creamy texture should begin to take place. Now with these mushrooms, I did a nice rustic cut. I just quartered. You could slice them if you'd like to. Sometimes I like roasting them whole and then slicing them because you get a lot of better flavor out of it. So that's all subjective. Herbs we're going to use today is fresh thyme. I love thyme. I think thyme and mushrooms were meant to be, especially with white wine and garlic. So it really brings this dish together. We're going to add that closer to the end. Thyme's a very earthy herb, so it really goes well with mushrooms. They play together well. And it's a very stubborn herb, so you can grow it pretty well at your house. It's hard to make it go away. All right, so we're going to back off. Stir this every once in a while. Okay, don't walk away from it too long, but just make sure you let the love happen. Okay? So while that's going, sure we got enough liquid for our last step. I add one more ladle. That way it can cook. Now at this point you can go ahead and season a little bit. You want to be careful with dishes that you cook for a long time. And true risotto usually takes 15 to 20 minutes to make risotto. It's not a 5 to 10 minute dish. So dishes that concentrate flavors you want to be careful when you're seasoning. You can season just a little bit at the beginning, but be careful because those flavors are going to concentrate. So we're going to hit it with just a little bit of salt and pepper. Some of that starch is starting to release. Starting to get a nice creamy texture there. Don't forget, if you're using Parmesan cheese, there's a high salt content in Parmesan. So that's also going to add some salty flavor to it at the end of the dish. We will finish with a touch of butter too, but I like using unsalted butter. That way I can control the salt content that goes in my dish. Oh, this is looking real good. Remember I said thyme was a earthy, stubborn herb, so we're going to go ahead and add that a little sooner so it kind of brings out some of that flavor. And I'll save just a little bit to garnish our plate with. I'll take this off the burner to stir it. So now we're getting nice and thick, nice and creamy. Oh, I can smell that thyme right when it hits the pan. All right, so we're getting close to the consistency we're looking for. Now what we need to do is check for the texture. True risotto should have an al dente mouthfeel or texture. So it shouldn't be totally soft or totally mushy. It should have a bite to it. And that's literally what al dente means. It means to the tooth. So it should have a little bit of texture when you bite into it. Oh, that's looking real good. I like to draw my spoon. Got a little bit of moisture still yet. We're going to go ahead and add our last round of liquids. And I always like to save a little bit just in case it gets too thick when I add my cheese, or I have the heat too high and it evaporates too quick. I still have just a little bit left just to be sure. So it's always a good idea to have a little bit of extra stock just in case something goes wrong. All right, that's looking real good. So if you were wanting to make lobster risotto, substitute the mushroom stock for lobster stock, right? Still keep the onions and your garlic and your aromatics, all that's subjective, right? All that is subjective. I got a saying, cooking's always a science until we eat it, and that's when food becomes subjective, right? So this technique's always a science. Stay true to this technique. All the subjective things like your flavor profiles and not enough salt, too much heat, that's all subjective. But if you stay true to this technique, you can make any risotto you want to make. All right. So at this stage, we're looking for the texture component. So it would be safe to go ahead and taste it to see where your flavor is, to see where your texture is. Maybe you need a dash of salt. Maybe you need more liquid to let it cook a touch longer. This is where we're going to check that. Good flavor. Texture's still got a little crunch to it, so we're gonna let it go just for a few more minutes. And then we'll finish with our Parmesan cheese, fresh herbs. I'm gonna put some thyme in there. Some more cracked pepper. So how is a risotto supposed to look when it's finished, right? A lot of people have different opinions. A rule of thumb that I've used in the industry is once a risotto hits the plate, it should evenly flow without anybody touching it or any outside interference. So if I was to take this risotto and put it on a plate, it should evenly flow to the edge of that plate without anybody touching it. That shows you have a good consistency and the right viscosity for that risotto on a plate. What's tough about risotto is once you cook it, it's going to keep absorbing just like any other starch. So once you cook it and plate it, it needs to immediately go out to the table or immediately be eaten at home, or it's going to continue to get thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker until eventually you could flip your plate over and it won't even move. So make sure you do eat it after it gets on the plate for the best experience. All right. So now we're looking good. See my viscosity starting to thicken up, get a little creamy. Okay. Got a little bit of liquid I had left. I'm glad I kept it because it's a little thick. I'll thin it out. The reason is, just like I told you earlier in the segment, we're going to add some cheese. We're going to add some cheese. Let's get it cleaned up. All right, so I'm going to finish with a pat of butter. Parmesan cheese. Go ahead and turn the heat off. I'm actually going to take it off so I can stir it better. Oh yeah. The way I like to check myself, take my spoon in the pan, pull it, see how it oozes right back. That lets me know I'm pretty close to the consistency I'm wanting. See how it's flowing back on its own? But the longer I let it sit here, the more it's going to tighten up and the more it's going to thicken. So I need to go straight to a plate and ready to serve. Okay. Oh yeah, I can see the cheese stringing, earthiness from the mushrooms. Some fresh thyme. Some more parsley to top it off. And there you have a mushroom risotto.